Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of precision.
Right, like it's very clinical.
Exactly. It's almost like engineering.
Yeah.
Like you fall off your bike, your arm is just throbbing, so you go to the ER.
Yeah, and they bring out the X-ray machine.
Right. And the X-ray shows that stark, jagged white line right across the radius. The doctor clips it to the light board, points right at it and says, well, there it is.
Yeah, it's totally binary. It's either broken or it's not.
Exactly. Broken or not broken, it's clean. And it's comforting in a way, right? We like things to be visible. We like reality to be easily categorized and undeniably right there in front of us.
Sure, because we rely on empirical evidence to, anchor our understanding of the world. When the physical evidence aligns perfectly with what we're experiencing, there's no cognitive dissonance.
But then you step into other fields, right?
Yeah.
Say the world of neurodevelopment or complex trauma or chronic autoimmune conditions, and suddenly that X-ray machine feels completely useless.
Oh, absolutely.
We start looking at a diagnostic landscape that is, honestly, it's just murky. The physical markers aren't just sitting there waving at you.
It becomes the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. You have symptoms, you have experiences, but tracking down the underlying mechanisms requires incredibly sophisticated indirect methods.
Yeah. And I bring that up because today, for this deep dive, we're wading into some deeply muddy waters of a different kind. But here's the catch. We're bringing the X-ray machine with us.
I like that framing.
Thanks. Today we're looking at a book that claims to be a literal history of millions of ancient Americans. But when scientists bring out their archaeological and genetic X-ray machines, the bones just don't match the body.
We really don't.
We are diving deep into the historical claims of the Book of Mormon. We have a massive stack of sources in front of us today, outlining the major historical, textual, and genetic questions associated with the text.
And we're also looking at the specific objections raised by LDS apologists and the rebuttals to those defenses, exactly as they're laid out in our material.
Right. And before we really get into the weeds here, I think it's absolutely crucial that we explicitly set the ground rules for this conversation.
Yes, very important. We are dealing with material today that touches on deeply held religious beliefs, personal faith, and, potentially sensitive historical arguments.
Absolutely.
So I want to make it unequivocally clear to you listening right now, our mission today is not to endorse a specific theological side.
No, not at all.
We are not here to attack anyone's faith, nor are we here to validate it. Instead, our goal is to impartially report on the arguments, the objections, and the counter-rebuttals exactly as they are presented in the provided source material.
Yeah, we want to help you understand the mechanics of this historical debate. We're just looking at the data, the claims, and the counterclaims. We're just observing the architecture of the arguments, right?
Exactly. We are looking at the blueprints. We want to understand how this debate functions from the inside out.
And the foundation of this entire discussion rests on one very specific premise, which our sources highlight right at the top. The Book of Mormon does not claim to be allegorical.
Right.
It does not present itself as like inspirational fiction or an extended spiritual metaphor or a parable. It claims to be literal, physical history.
Its own subtitle is literally another testament of Jesus Christ.
Yeah. And the founder of the Latter-day Saint movement, Joseph Smith, declared it the most correct of any book on earth. And our sources point out that LDS scripture itself, specifically Doctrine and Covenants, section 17, actually records the risen Christ, declaring that the book is literally true.
Which is the pivot point for everything we're about to discuss today. When a text claims to describe real cities, fighting real wars in a real physical location, in this case, the pre-Columbian Americas, it makes itself testable.
Right, you can verify it.
Exactly. As the source material points out, 2 Timothy talks about Scripture being God-breathed, and the argument made in our sources is that truth and historical detail isn't optional for genuine Scripture.
If it says it happened, it needs to have happened.
Right. A document that systematically misdescribes the world it claims as its setting fails the very test it sets for itself. If it claims a massive civilization lived somewhere, we should be able to find their trash, their graves, and their homes.
Okay, let's unpack this. If we are moving from the spiritual claims to the physical footprint, where do we even start? When we're looking for a civilization of millions of people in ancient America, if I'm an archaeologist looking for the Nephites, what exactly am I looking for?
Well, we start with the dirt. We start with the fundamental building blocks of archaeology and biology. The Book of Mormon describes massive, sprawling civilizations.
Right, the Nephites and the Lamanites.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Who supposedly arrived from Jerusalem around 600 BC. And then you have the Jaredites, who supposedly arrived much earlier, around the time of the Tower of Babel.
So a huge span of time.
A massive span. These civilizations span roughly from 2200 BC to about 421 AD. And the text attributes to these civilizations a very specific, highly detailed list of old world plants, animals, and technologies.
And these aren't just like passing mentions in a poem, right? Our sources say these are foundational to their economy and their warfare.
They are completely central. We're talking about horses being ridden and yoked to chariots. We're talking about domesticated livestock, cattle, oxen, sheep, goats, swine.
All the classic farm animals.
Right. We're also talking about staple agricultural crops like wheat and barley. We're talking about advanced metallurgy.
Like weapons.
Yes, steel swords, iron weapons, breastplates, and coined money. Silk, too. And in the Book of Ether, which covers that much older Jaredite period, it explicitly mentions elephants.
Elephants in ancient America.
Oh.
Okay. And the problem, according to the archaeological records cited in our sources, is that none of those things were actually there. When the X-ray hits the dirt, those specific bones just don't exist.
Precisely. None of them existed in the pre-Columbian Americas, meaning before Christopher Columbus arrived in 1492. Pre-Columbian horses actually went extinct on the American continent around 10,000 BC.
Wow, that's way before the timeline of the book.
Right, at the end of the last ice age. And they weren't reintroduced until the Spanish brought them over in the early 1500s. There were also no wheeled vehicles used for transport, no chariots, and no draft animals to pull them.
Wait, I want to pause on that because it's a fascinating detail in the sources. You're saying the wheel wasn't used for transport at all in the entire continent?
Not for transport, no.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. Mesoamerican cultures understood the concept of the wheel. Archaeologists have actually found children's toys with little wheels on them.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, but they never applied it to transportation or agriculture. And the reason why is simple. They didn't have beasts of burden.
Oh, that makes total sense.
Right. Without horses or oxen, a cart isn't terribly useful in dense jungle or mountainous terrain. You just be dragging it yourself.
That's a great point. The technology evolves alongside the biology that's available.
Exactly. And the agricultural foundation of Mesoamerica was the classic three sisters, right? Corn, beans, and squash. Not old world crops like wheat and barley.
And what about the metals?
As for metallurgy, indigenous cultures worked beautifully with gold, silver, and copper for ornamentation. But there is absolutely no evidence of steel or iron smelting for weapons or tools.
And the elephants?
Mammoths and mastodons, the elephant equivalents in the Americas, died out thousands of years before the Jaredites supposedly arrived.
Now, I have to jump in here because if I'm putting myself in the shoes of someone defending the text, the very first thing I'm going to say is, couldn't this just be a classic case of absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence?
Right. That's the immediate logical defense.
I mean, the Americas are vast, right?
Yeah.
We haven't excavated the entire continent. Isn't it possible we just haven't dug in the right spot yet? Maybe the steel swords and horse bones are under some unexcavated jungle canopy in Guatemala?
It's a very common defense, and intuitively, it sounds perfectly reasonable. But our sources provide a really robust counter by explaining how archaeology actually functions in the real world.
Okay, how so?
The principle of absence of evidence is not evidence of absence is valid, but only in very narrow contexts. It applies when we haven't seriously looked, or when the thing we're looking for is incredibly fragile and would naturally decay without a trace.
Like finding a specific wooden bowl or something.
Exactly. But neither of those conditions applies here. Mesoamerican archaeology has been intensely, meticulously studied for well over a century.
Right.
The Olmec, the Maya, the Zapotec, the Aztec, these civilizations are incredibly well documented by modern science.
Yeah, our sources emphasize that we know their trade routes, we know their pottery styles, we can literally read Maya glyphs and trace the exact lineage of their kings down to the specific dates they ascended the throne.
We know an astonishing amount about them, and here is the key to understanding this rebuttal. Real civilizations of this scale. And remember, the Book of Mormon describes populations numbering in the millions.
Millions, yeah, with huge standing armies.
Right. They leave an overwhelming physical footprint. Think of ancient Egypt or Greece or Rome. They leave pyramids, roads, widespread language, and massive, massive trash middens.
Because millions of people throw away a lot of garbage.
Exactly. Even much smaller ancient peoples, like the Philistines in the Levant, left easily detectable traces in the pottery record. The total invisibility of the Nephites and Lamanites isn't like looking for a lost needle in a haystack.
It's like looking for a lost mountain range.
That's a perfect way to put it. Furthermore, let's talk about the specific items. Horse bones, especially the teeth, are incredibly durable. They preserve beautifully across thousands of years.
Wait, really? The teeth?
Oh, yeah. We find the bones and teeth of Ice Age horses from 12,000 years ago all over the continent. If millions of people were breeding and riding horses from 600 BC to 400 AD, their teeth would literally be everywhere.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about the crops? Wheat and barley. You can't just lose an entire staple crop, can you?
You really can't. And the reason is palynology, which is the study of pollen.
Pollen, like what makes my allergies act up?
Exactly the same stuff. Lakebed sediment cores in Mesoamerica preserve pollen incredibly well. Scientists can drill down into a lakebed, pull up a core of mud, date the layers, and look at the microscopic pollen grains to tell you exactly what plants were growing in that specific region in, say, 400 BC.
Oh, wow. That's incredibly precise.
It is. We see the pollen for corn, for amaranth, for squash, but scientists find absolutely zero trace of wheat or barley pollen in those pre-Columbian layers.
I imagine making steel is pretty messy too, right?
Oh, making steel requires massive industrial infrastructure. You need blast furnaces, huge amounts of slag, charcoal pits, and iron mines. You can't forge millions of steel swords in secret.
Right, you can't just do that in your backyard.
No. The environmental footprint of smelting is permanent. So the absence of these things in the Americas isn't just a provisional lack of data. It is highly informative data. The dirt is actively telling us they weren't there.
That brings up a really interesting pivot point in our sources. Because if the literal items aren't in the dirt, defenders of the text have to offer an alternative explanation for why those specific words are printed on the page.
They do.
And that leads us to the loose translation theory. The idea here is, what if the word horse in the text is just Joseph Smith using a familiar English word for a native animal he just didn't have a name for?
Right, like substituting a known word for an unknown concept.
Yeah, exactly. Like, say, a tapir or a deer. And maybe steel just means hardened volcanic glass, like the obsidian blades the Maya actually used. Or maybe wheat was just his way of saying amaranth.
The sources address this defense directly, and the counter-argument is multifaceted. First and foremost, from a purely logical standpoint, the critics argue that this defense makes the text entirely unfalsifiable.
Let's define that for the listener really quick. Unfalsifiable means there's no possible way to prove it wrong, right? No matter what evidence you find.
Correct. If every single historical contradiction can be reinterpreted as a translation anomaly, then the Book of Mormon cannot be tested against any historical evidence whatsoever.
Right.
If horse actually means tapir, and steel actually means wood with obsidian shards, and silk means spun rabbit fur, then you really aren't doing history anymore.
It stops being historical theory and becomes like a reflexive rescue device.
Exactly. An argument that cannot be falsified by any conceivable evidence isn't considered a strong argument in historical studies. It's seen as a refusal to actually take the test.
It's like playing a game where the other person constantly changes the rules every time you score a point, you know?
Yeah.
But our sources point out that the text itself kind of corners you, doesn't it? Because of the verbs used and the context provided around these items.
Yes, the textual details definitively rule out these biological substitutions.
Right.
Let's look at the tapir theory, which is a very famous one in apologetic circles.
Okay.
The Book of Mormon explicitly describes horses being prepared for travel, kept in stables, and yoked to chariots for kings to ride in. Now, a tapir is a relatively small, pig-like jungle mammal. It has a sloping back. It cannot pull a chariot. It cannot be ridden into battle. A deer cannot bear an adult warrior in heavy armor. The verbs don't match the substituted nouns.
You can't just swap the noun and ignore what the noun is actually doing in the sentence. You can't imagine an ancient king riding a pig-like tapir into a war zone.
Precisely. And the same goes for the metallurgy. The text describes steel swords being made by metallurgical processes, explicitly mentioning melting and casting.
And you can't cast chipped obsidian rock. You chip it, you don't melt it.
Exactly. And here's a really fascinating textual detail regarding the crops. The Book of Mormon mentions wheat alongside corn, distinguishing the two in the exact same passage.
Wait, really?
Yes. So if wheat was just Joseph Smith's loose translation for a native crop like maize, why does the text already have corn available as a distinct separate word?
Oh, that's a huge point. If he already has the word for corn, he wouldn't use wheat as a stand-in for corn. Not to mention, our sources point out that if every single anachronism is just a loose translation, It's incredibly suspicious that the substitutions line up perfectly 100% of the time with the exact flora, fauna, and technology of 1820s upstate New York.
It's a very convenient coincidence.
Right. Horses, cattle, sheep, wheat, steel. It matches the author's 19th century environment perfectly rather than looking like random translation errors from an ancient Mesoamerican text.
And as our sources point out, we have to look at how the translation process was actually described by the people who were physically in the room.
Oh, this is important. What did the witnesses say?
Joseph Smith and the witnesses to the translation men, like David Whitmer and Martin Harris, didn't describe a loose or conceptual process where Smith was grasping for the right word.
They didn't.
No. They described a highly controlled, literal process. They said English words appeared on a seer stone. Smith read them aloud to a scribe, and the words would not disappear until they were written down correctly. That narrative leaves absolutely no room for Smith accidentally writing horse when the divine text actually meant jungle tapir.
Which really forces another major shift in how the history is defended. Because you can't change the words, and you can't find the artifacts in the dirt. Maybe you're just looking at too big of a map.
I want to talk about the limited geography theory because the sources frame this as a massive shift in the narrative.
It is a profound paradigm shift. For the first 150 years of LDS history, the teaching was almost universally hemispheric.
Meaning the whole continent.
Right. The idea was that the events of the Book of Mormon covered all of North and South America. Lehi landed in South America, they migrated north over centuries, and the final apocalyptic battle where the Nephite civilization was destroyed happened at the Hill Cumorah in upstate New York.
Which, conveniently, is the exact same hill where Joseph Smith supposedly found the gold plates centuries later.
Exactly. That was the standard accepted history for generations.
Okay, so what changed? In the mid to late 20th century, as the total lack of archaeological evidence across the hemisphere became undeniable, apologetic scholars developed the limited geography theory.
Okay.
They suggested that the entire narrative actually took place in a relatively small region, typically isolated to Mesoamerica, so modern-day southern Mexico and Guatemala.
Okay, I have an analogy for this based on what the sources say. It feels like someone claiming the Roman Empire existed.
Right.
But when historians go looking for Rome, they find no ruins, no Latin texts, no aqueducts, and no Roman coins.
Sure.
So instead of admitting Rome wasn't there, the person says, well, the Roman Empire actually existed entirely within the borders of a single modern-day zip code in rural Ohio, and they just built out of biodegradable woods. That's why you can't find it.
It shrinks the claim to avoid the evidence.
Right. It's the structure of an intellectual rescue. It's an attempt to fit a square peg into a round hole by aggressively whittling down the peg. And the counter from our sources is that limiting the geography doesn't actually solve the underlying problem at all.
Because even if you shrink the map to Mesoamerica, you still don't have horses.
Exactly. Mesoamerica still lacks pre-Columbian horses, chariots, steel, and wheat. You haven't solved the anachronisms. You've just concentrated the missing evidence into a smaller, heavily excavated region where we know even more definitively that those things didn't exist.
And our sources note that the limited geography theory creates massive internal contradictions within LDS theology itself. It directly contradicts Joseph Smith's own teachings about the Hill Cumorah in New York.
Right, because if the final battle happened in Mesoamerica, how on earth did the gold plates get buried in a hill in upstate New York?
To make it work, apologists often have to argue for the two Cumorahs theory.
Wait, two of them?
Yes. They suggest there was one Hill Cumorah in Mesoamerica where millions of people died in battle, and then the final prophet, Moroni, must have hauled these incredibly heavy gold plates thousands of miles north on foot to bury them in a completely different hill in New York, which just coincidentally was also called Cumorah.
Wow. That is an incredibly strained harmonization that the text itself really doesn't support.
No, it doesn't.
Okay, so if the physical footprint, the swords, the crops, the animals, the cities, is missing from the dirt, what about the biological footprint? Let's talk about the human bodies themselves.
Yes, genetics.
If millions of Israelites lived, bred, and died in the Americas, surely their bodies left a record in the DNA. I really want to look at the genetics here.
This is where the scientific advancements of the last 30 years have profoundly changed the debate. The central historical claim of the Book of Mormon, taught explicitly by Joseph Smith and generations of subsequent LDS leaders, is that Native Americans are literal, biological descendants of Lehi's family.
Who traveled from Jerusalem around 600 BC.
Correct. For decades, the official introduction printed at the front of the Book of Mormon explicitly stated that the Lamanites were the principal ancestors of the American Indians.
That is a very clear, testable biological claim. You can't get more testable than that.
It is. And then came the sequencing of the human genome and the mapping of global human migration patterns using DNA.
So what happens when the genetic X-ray machine gets turned on?
The results in our sources are unequivocal. DNA evidence has established beyond a reasonable scientific doubt that Native Americans descend overwhelmingly from Asian populations.
Asian population.
Yes. Populations who migrated across the Bering Land Bridge or along the Pacific coast thousands of years before Lehi supposedly arrived.
Let's break down how we know that just briefly. What are we actually looking at in the DNA? Like, how does this work?
Geneticists look at haplogroups. You can think of a haplogroup like a genetic breadcrumb trail. It's a group of people who share a common ancestor, identified by specific mutations in their DNA.
Okay, I'm following.
When we look at the mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down intact from mother to child of Native American populations, we find haplogroups A, B, C, D, and X. All of these trace back directly to ancestral populations in Siberia and East Asia.
And what about the Middle East?
What we do not find are the haplogroups associated with the ancient Middle East. There are 0 pre-Columbian Middle Eastern or Hebrew haplogroups found in Native American populations.
Okay, but let's push back on that, based on what the apologists argue, because population genetics is complicated, right? What if Lehi's family was just a tiny drop in a massive genetic bucket?
The dilution theory, yes.
Right. Let's say they arrive in the Americas, and there are already millions of Asian-descended people living there. Lehi's family intermarries with them, and over the course of thousands of years, their Hebrew DNA simply gets washed out.
Yep.
It gets diluted to the point where modern geneticists just can't detect it today.
This is formally known as the small founder population defense, or genetic introgression. And the sources counter this on multiple fronts. First, population genetics at this scale simply doesn't work that way.
It doesn't.
No. As I mentioned, maternal mitochondrial DNA is incredibly stable. It doesn't get washed out in the way we think of mixing paint in a bucket.
Oh, interesting.
If a population of millions descends from a specific group of founding mothers, the marker survives. Across hundreds of thousands of genetic samples taken across the Americas, there should be some trace, but there is 0.
But even beyond the science of mitochondrial DNA, there's a textual problem with that defense, isn't there?
A massive textual problem. This defense completely contradicts the narrative of the Book of Mormon itself.
How so?
The text does not describe a small, quiet tribe arriving and being peacefully absorbed into a massive existing population. It explicitly describes the land as being kept hidden and empty for them by God.
Oh, wow.
And it describes them multiplying to become a civilization of millions, building vast cities, fielding massive armies, and dominating the landscape for 1,000 years. A population of that magnitude, intermarrying and spreading across a continent, leaves an indelible genetic trace.
You literally can't have a civilization of millions of people who are biologically invisible.
Exactly. And the final, most devastating counter to the dilution defense comes from ancient DNA. We aren't just relying on the DNA of modern Native Americans whose genetics might have been impacted by post-Columbian European contact.
Right, because of colonization.
Right, but the Reich Laboratory at Harvard Medical School, for example, maintains the largest database of ancient human genomes in the world.
Wait, how does that work? Are they pulling DNA from old bone?
Yes. Specifically, they extract DNA from the petrous bone in the skull or from ancient teeth, which preserve genetic material incredibly well. They are directly sequencing the genomes of pre-Columbian human remains.
That's amazing.
They are testing the very people who lived in the Americas during the supposed Book of Mormon timeline of 600 BC to 400 AD, and the results are pure Asian-derived ancestry. There is no Hebrew DNA to be diluted. They are looking right at the biological reality of the ancient Americas, and the Book of Mormon narrative simply isn't in the code.
And the institutional reaction to this data is really stunning. Our sources point out that in 2007, the LDS Church made a very quiet but monumental change to the official introduction of the Book of Mormon.
They did.
They changed the phrase stating the Lamanites were the principal ancestors of the American Indians to say that they are among the ancestors of the American Indians.
It is a single word change, but it represents a seismic theological retreat.
It's massive. You have a core foundational doctrine taught as absolute literal truth by prophets for 175 years, retreating to become completely unfalsifiable in the face of modern science.
Because if they are just among the ancestors, any tiny genetically invisible group could theoretically be among them.
Right. It's the ultimate safe harbor from scientific scrutiny. You don't have to prove they existed anymore.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it forces a pivotal realization. If the physical evidence, the dirt, the artifacts, the pollen, doesn't point to ancient Jerusalem, and the genetic evidence, the DNA, the haplogroups, doesn't point to ancient Jerusalem,
Mhm.
we have to ask a fundamental question.
Which
Where does the text point?
brings us directly to the cultural footprint. Because if the text doesn't look ancient, we have to ask what it does look like. And according to our sources, when you analyze the themes, the anxieties, and the specific debates happening in the pages of the Book of Mormon, it looks exactly like upstate New York in the 1820s.
The argument here is that the Book of Mormon perfectly mirrors the very specific religious, political, and cultural controversies of Joseph Smith's immediate environment.
Which was famously known as the burned-over district, right?
Exactly, because it was so heavily swept by religious revivals.
Let's get specific. What kind of 19th century controversies are we talking about finding in this supposedly ancient book?
Let's start with the anti-Masonic panic. In 1826, just a few years before the Book of Mormon was published, a man named William Morgan lived in western New York.
Okay.
He became disillusioned with the Freemasons and threatened to publish a book revealing all their secret rituals and oaths. Shortly after, Morgan was kidnapped, thrown into a carriage, and disappeared.
Wow. And it was widely believed he was murdered by Masons to protect their secrets, right?
Yes. And this wasn't just a local true crime story. It exploded. It sparked a massive, frenzied national conspiracy theory.
People were terrified.
Absolutely. People believed Masons had infiltrated the highest levels of government and the justice system, covering up murders to protect their brethren. It even led to the creation of the anti-Masonic political party.
Okay, so how does this show up in the text?
Now look at the Book of Mormon. The text features extensive, repetitive warnings about secret combinations. It describes ancient Gadianton robbers who use secret oaths, signs, and handshakes to infiltrate the government, pervert justice, and commit murder to protect their secret society.
So it reads like a thinly veiled, anciently flavored commentary on the exact newspaper headlines Joseph Smith and his neighbors were reading every single day.
It does, and it's not just 19th century politics, it's heavily 19th century theology. The Book of Mormon resolves the specific theological debates of Protestant America in the 1820s.
For instance,
Moroni chapter 8 contains a massive, passionate denunciation of infant baptism, calling it an awful wickedness and a mockery before God.
and why is that anachronistic? I mean, baptism is an ancient concept.
Because the debate over infant baptism, specifically whether unbaptized infants are damned to hell, was a huge burning controversy in 1820s American Protestantism, primarily between Calvinists and Baptists.
Why?
Why would a 4th century ancient American prophet living in Mesoamerica care deeply about the specific theological nuances of 19th century frontier revivalism?
It's like finding a debate about artificial intelligence in a text claiming to be from the Middle Ages.
That's a great analogy. You also have a political philosophy. King Mosiah gives a long speech about transitioning his society from a monarchy to a republic of elected judges.
Let me guess, it sounds like American democracy.
And the arguments he uses sound exactly like Jacksonian-era American Republican thought. He talks about the burden of wicked kings and the wisdom of the common people. And the text also tackles the massive Protestant debate between Calvinism and Arminianism, the argument over predestination versus free will, using the exact vocabulary of 19th century preachers.
This cultural mirroring brings us to a specific historical document that our sources highlight as a major problem for the text's ancient claims, a book called View of the Hebrews.
Yes.
In 1823, 7 years before the Book of Mormon was published, a Congregationalist minister named Ethan Smith published this book in Poultney, Vermont. His central thesis was that Native Americans were descended from the lost tribes of Israel.
Which was a popular theory at the time.
Right. And get this, because this connection absolutely blew my mind when I first read it in the sources. Oliver Cowdery, who was Joseph Smith's primary scribe, the guy who physically wrote down most of the Book of Mormon as Smith dictated it.
Yes.
Oliver Cowdery lived in Poultney, Vermont at the exact same time. Ethan Smith was the pastor of the local church there, writing and publishing this book.
It is a staggering historical connection. Cowdery's family literally attended that church, and the structural parallels between View of the Hebrews and the Book of Mormon are profound.
Let's lay out those parallels for the listener.
Both books claim Israelite origins for Native Americans. Both texts divide the ancient Americans into two distinct branches, a civilized, faithful branch and a savage, nomadic branch that eventually wipes out the civilized one.
Which is exactly the Nephite and Lamanite dynamic.
Exactly. Both feature lost, sacred records preserved by the civilized branch. Both anticipate a latter-day gathering of the tribes led by the American Republic. The overarching narrative framework is nearly identical.
Now, if I'm defending the Book of Mormon, I think the natural response here is to say, well, so what? Couldn't this just be ideas that were in the air at the time?
Right, parallel thinking.
Yeah. It was a common 19th century speculation that Native Americans were Israelites. Just because two books share a cultural premise doesn't necessarily mean one copied the other.
And the counter from historians is, yes, the ideas were in the air. That is exactly the point. The Book of Mormon is a product of the air it was breathing.
It's absorbing its environment.
It isn't a random coincidence. It is evidence of cultural derivation. When a text so perfectly reflects the speculations, the literature, and the theological anxieties of 1820s New England, the most logical conclusion is that it was written in 1820s New England.
It's not an ancient text predicting modern times. It's a modern text dressed up in ancient clothes.
What's deeply compelling here is the internal LDS history regarding this very issue. In the early 1920s, a high-ranking LDS general authority and brilliant official church historian named B.H. Roberts was asked by church leadership to study these critical issues and provide answers.
Okay, so they took it seriously.
Very seriously. Roberts conducted a massive private study, and his conclusion was shocking. He concluded that the parallels with View of the Hebrews were so striking that, in his words, a case might be made out that the Book of Mormon derived from it.
Wait, a top church historian admitted this?
Yes, privately. He maintained his faith, but he intellectually recognized this as a massive, unresolved apologetic problem. He presented his findings to the leadership, and his secret manuscript, titled Studies of the Book of Mormon, wasn't officially published until the 1980s.
Wow. When your own most brilliant historian sees the 19th century fingerprints, the problem cannot be easily dismissed.
But apologists do have another defense here regarding the text itself. They argue for the absolute uniqueness of the language.
The way it's written.
Yes.
But
They say, look, Joseph Smith was writing in a style of pseudo-biblical English that no one in the 19th century was using. It's completely unique, therefore it must be divine.
our sources thoroughly dismantle this claim of uniqueness, right?
Completely. Far from being unique, writing in a deliberately archaic, King James-style English was actually a thriving, highly recognized literary genre in the late 18th and early 19th centuries.
People just wrote like that on purpose?
Yes, they used it to give their writing a sense of gravity and historical weight. The sources highlight a specific book from 1816 called The Late War Between the United States and Great Britain.
What was it about?
It was essentially a children's textbook about the War of 1812, but it was written entirely in pseudo-biblical King James English.
No way.
Yes, it used chapter and verse structures. It used the phrase, and it came to pass constantly. It described modern warfare cannons and ships in ancient-sounding biblical terms, and it was widely circulated in upstate New York during Joseph Smith's youth.
So when you realize this specific literary genre existed and was popular, the Book of Mormon stops looking like an inexplicable linguistic miracle. It just starts looking like an ambitious, sprawling entry into an existing 19th century literary form.
Exactly.
So if the themes point to the 1820s and the literary style points to 19th century pseudo-biblical literature, we really have to look closely at the actual Bible it was supposedly mimicking. And this brings us to what the sources call the most devastating textual evidence in the stack.
The King James Version problem.
Yes. Let's get into this.
When textual critics examine the Book of Mormon, this is the issue that essentially closes the case for many of them. The Book of Mormon contains entire chapters of the 1611 King James Version of the Bible, reproduced verbatim.
Like word for word.
Word for word. We're talking huge chunks of Isaiah, the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew and Malachi. And it doesn't just reproduce the text, it includes the exact chapter and verse divisions.
Why is that a problem? Weren't chapters and verses always in the Bible?
Not at all. Ancient Hebrew and Greek manuscripts did not have chapter and verse divisions. They were continuous text.
Ooh, I didn't know that.
The chapter divisions we use today were created by a medieval monk named Stephen Langton in the 13th century.
The 13th century.
Yes. And the verse divisions were added by a printer named Robert Estienne in the 16th century. If Joseph Smith were translating ancient plates from 600 BC, those specific medieval European divisions would not exist in his translation.
But apologists have a counter for this, right? The concept of divine accommodation.
Yes, that's their primary defense.
The idea is basically, God knows Joseph Smith is reading the translation off a seer stone. God knows Joseph is familiar with the King James Bible. So when they hit a section of Isaiah on the ancient plates, God just feeds Joseph the 1611 King James text to make it easy for him and his 19th century audience to read.
It's a clever theological workaround, but the sources introduce a concept that absolutely shatters this defense. KJV italics.
Yes. Walk us through how this works, because this is the absolute smoking gun of the entire deep dive.
We have to look at the translation mechanics of the 1611 King James Bible. When the translation committee at Hampton Court was working from the Masoretic Hebrew text, they frequently found that Hebrew syntax didn't flow smoothly when translated directly into English.
Right. Languages don't map one-to-one.
Exactly. Hebrew can be very terse. So, to make the English readable, the translators frequently added English filler words that did not exist in the original Hebrew text.
Just to smooth it out.
Yes. But to be intellectually honest with the reader, they printed those inserted non-Hebrew words in italics.
So it's basically the 1611 translators putting a sticky note on the page saying, hey, we added this specific word to help the sentence make sense, but it wasn't in the original ancient scroll.
Exactly. For example, in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 1, the KJV translators inserted the word such and italicized it. The word such exists in no ancient Hebrew manuscript of Isaiah. It is a 17th century English invention.
Okay, and how does this affect the Book of Mormon?
Yet in 2 Nephi chapter 19, verse 1, in the Book of Mormon, which claims to be a direct translation of ancient brass plates carried out of Jerusalem in 600 BC, that exact italicized word, such, is perfectly preserved.
Well,
and this doesn't just happen once. It happens across dozens of italicized words imported directly into the Book of Mormon.
if Joseph Smith were truly translating an ancient Hebrew document, those specifically 17th century English filler words would not be there. Their presence proves, beyond any textual doubt, that the author was looking at a printed post-1611 King James Bible, not an ancient golden plate.
And the textual problems go even deeper than italics. The Book of Mormon also preserves 17th century translation errors.
Oh, wow. Give me an example of an error.
A classic example is the Hebrew word tanim. In ancient Hebrew, it means jackals, or sometimes sea creatures, depending on the context. But the 1611 KJV translators misunderstood the word and translated it into English as dragons.
Dragons.
Yes. So in Nephi 8.9 in the Book of Mormon, it perfectly preserves that 1611 mistake reading, wounded the dragon. Now think about the divine accommodation defense. Divine accommodation might explain God using thee and thou to sound familiar, but God would not accommodate a 17th century committee's blatant mistranslation of a text he supposedly authored. God knows what a jackal is.
Right. But the apologists push back hard here. They point to Hebraisms. They argue that the text is packed with ancient Hebrew literary structures that an uneducated Joseph Smith couldn't possibly have known.
Yes, that's a very common defense.
The classic example that everyone quotes is the phrase, "and it came to pass," which appears something like 1,400 times in the Book of Mormon. And they also point to chiasmus, which is this ancient poetic structure where the ideas go A, B, C, B, A. They say, how could he fake chiasmus?
The counter here requires us to look at Joseph Smith's actual environment. Joseph Smith was utterly steeped in the King James Bible from childhood. His family read it constantly.
Right.
And the KJV itself preserves a massive amount of Hebrew phrasing translated directly into English. Let's take, and it came to pass. That is simply the standard KJV English translation of the common Hebrew word, wehi.
It's all over the Old Testament.
It is. It was also all over other 19th century pseudo-biblical books like the Late War. Reproducing it doesn't mean, ancient Hebrew. It just means you are successfully mimicking the cadence of the King James Bible.
And what about chiasmus, the mirrored poetic structure?
As for chiasmus, linguists point out that it is a natural, almost instinctual rhetorical device found in oral traditions and literature across many languages. It's not exclusive to ancient Hebrew at all.
Really? Where else do we see it?
You can find chiastic structures in children's books like Dr. Seuss. You can find them perfectly executed in the Gettysburg Address.
Lincoln used chiasmus.
Unintentionally, yes. because it sounds good rhetorically. And crucially, you find chiasmus in Joseph Smith's other revelations, like the Doctrine and Covenants, which do not even claim to be translations of ancient documents.
That's a huge point. Finding a repetitive pattern in a text doesn't prove it's ancient, especially when that same text is actively contradicting ancient Hebrew by including 17th century translation errors.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's summarize where we are. The physical dirt doesn't support the text. The DNA points to Asia. The cultural themes point to 1820s New York. And the literal text on the page points to a 1611 King James Bible. So the question remains, how do apologists explain the sheer feat of Joseph Smith actually dictating this massive book? This takes us to the authorship and dictation and what apologists call the bundle of miracles.
The foundational defense here is the narrative of the uneducated farm boy. The argument is that Joseph Smith was barely literate. He had only a few years of formal schooling.
His wife Emma later claimed he could barely write a coherent letter.
Right. Apologists argue that a man with that background couldn't possibly have mentally composed and dictated a complex 270,000-word book. Therefore, it must be a miracle.
I hear this one all the time. It's the David and Goliath story of literature. He was too simple to fake it.
But the sources address this by looking at the actual historical timeline and comparative religious history. First, the claim of illiteracy is vastly overstated. Smith was demonstrably literate.
He what?
Yes. He owned a Bible. He actively attended complex theological revivals. He participated in a local debate club. And he lived in a region absolutely saturated with religious publishing. He wasn't an isolated, ignorant peasant. He was a bright, imaginative young man immersed in a deeply religious oral culture.
Let's break down the math of the dictation, because I think people hear 270,000 words and think it's an impossible mountain to climb.
Let's look at the timeline. The dictation of the current text took place over roughly 60 to 90 working days. If you divide the word count by the days, it averages out to about 3,000 to 4,500 words per day.
Which, if you're typing it out, sounds like a very long day at the keyboard.
But he wasn't typing, he was dictating, he was speaking out loud, and 4,500 words is roughly 3 to 4 hours of normal conversational speaking per day.
Ooh, that's not that much, actually.
If you are steeped in the language of the King James Bible and you have a vivid imagination, speaking for 3 hours a day for 3 months is entirely manageable. We have perfect historical parallels that prove this.
Who else has done this?
Look at Ellen G. White, the foundational prophetess of Seventh-day Adventism. She had only 3 years of formal schooling due to a severe childhood injury. Yet she dictated and wrote over 100,000 pages of highly complex religious theology.
Wow.
Mary Baker Eddy produced the massive foundational text of Christian Science under similar constraints. The pattern of charismatic, modestly educated figures producing voluminous religious texts through dictation is actually quite common in 19th century American history. Smith fits the psychological and historical pattern perfectly.
But recently, there's been a new defense that tries to sidestep Joseph Smith entirely. It's the early modern English thesis. This one is wild to me.
Yes, this is a newer apologetic theory.
LDS scholars like Royal Skousen and Stanford Carmack are now arguing that the grammar of the Book of Mormon actually predates Joseph Smith. They claim it's full of English syntax from the 1500s or 1600s that Smith couldn't possibly have known.
It's a highly complex linguistic argument relying on massive databases of historical English. But the sources point out 2 fatal flaws with this defense.
What are they?
First, the methodology itself is heavily contested by historical linguists outside of the LDS community. Many of those supposedly early modern features, like using did go or plead instead of pleaded, actually appear quite frequently in 18th and 19th century rural dialects, revival sermons, and specifically in those pseudo-biblical texts we talked about.
So Smith was just using the archaic-sounding language of his environment.
Right. But the second flaw is the theological implication, right? Because if you accept this theory, look at what it does to the religion.
Oh, exactly. It is a devastating theological retreat. To save the text from the accusation that Smith wrote it, these scholars are arguing that Joseph Smith wasn't the actual translator.
They are forced to propose that some unknown early modern English-speaking ghost translator in the spiritual realm actually translated the ancient plates and then just fed that 16th century English into Joseph Smith's seer stone.
Which completely abandons the founding narrative of the LDS Church, which canonizes Smith himself as the active translator.
It really does.
And practically speaking, shifting the date of the English grammar by 200 years doesn't magically put horse bones or steel swords in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. It's a linguistic distraction from a massive historical problem.
Which brings us to the broader apologetic strategy. To survive the overwhelming physical and textual evidence, apologetics often rely on what historians call the bundle of miracles.
Right.
They rapid-fire a list of amazing, seemingly inexplicable feats to overwhelm the listener, hoping that the sheer volume of claims masks the weakness of each individual argument.
Let's unbundle those miracles. Let's walk through them one by one and look at the actual mechanisms behind them, starting with the translation process itself. The head in a hat miracle. Apologists say, look, Smith didn't even look at the plates. He just put a seer stone in a hat, shoved his face in to block out the light, and dictated perfect scripture. How could he fake that without notes?
The counter here is historical context. This wasn't a divine, unprecedented innovation. It was a direct continuation of 1820s rural folk magic. Joseph Smith was a known treasure digger.
Wait, treasure digging.
Yes, in fact, he was literally put on trial in 1826 before the Book of Mormon was written for glass-looking. He used that exact same stone and that exact same hat to claim he could see the location of buried pirate treasure or lost Spanish silver for paying customers.
So he was using the exact same method he used for treasure hunting, which never actually produced any treasure, to produce the book.
Exactly.
And the fact that the gold plates were often covered with a cloth on the table or hidden in another room entirely while he looked in his hat, that is the opposite of how translation works. If you don't need the physical document to translate it, why did ancient prophets spend centuries engraving them?
It's a massive logical gap. The next item in the bundle is the single draft claim. You'll hear that Smith dictated the whole thing straight through without ever revising a single word, which would be an incredible cognitive feat.
Is that true?
It is factually false. The LDS Church's own leading textual scholar, Royal Skousen, whom we just mentioned, has meticulously documented thousands of changes between the original dictated manuscript, the printer's manuscript, and the early published editions.
Thousands.
Yes. Many are grammatical fixes, but some are massive theological shifts. For example, in the 1830 edition, Mary is called the Mother of God. In the 1837 edition, it was changed to the Mother of the Son of God.
Oh, that's a huge difference.
That is a fundamental change reflecting Smith's evolving view of the Trinity. The text was absolutely revised.
Okay, what about the archaeological bullseyes? Apologists always point to NHM and Bountiful. The story is that in 1 Nephi, Lehi's family is traveling through the Arabian Peninsula, and they bury a man named Ishmael at a place called Nahom.
Right.
And modern apologists found an ancient altar in Yemen with the consonants NHM carved on it. They claim it's a bullseye prediction of an undiscovered location.
The sources dismantle the undiscovered part of that claim. The name NHM, referring to the Nim tribe or region in Yemen, was not unknown to the Western world.
It wasn't.
No. It was printed on European maps, specifically a highly detailed map by Karsten Niebuhr, published in 1772. Those maps and various travel accounts of Arabia were available in libraries and universities in early 19th century America.
So it's entirely plausible Smith had access to or heard of the name?
Exactly. Furthermore, NHM are just consonants. It could be Nahum, Nim, Nahum. And the companion location, Bountiful, is just a generic retrofit where apologists look for any coastal inlet in Oman that has a few trees and some water and say, aha, Bountiful.
Another linguistic miracle they claim is the name Mulek. They say Smith guessed the exact name of an ancient Hebrew prince. The argument is that Mulek is a perfect Hebrew name for a king's son.
It's true that Mulek is based on the Hebrew root MLK, which means king, but Smith didn't guess it out of thin air. The name Malchiah, who is identified as the son of Hamelech, which literally translates to son of the king, is sitting right there in Joseph Smith's King James Bible. In Jeremiah 38.6, Smith simply took a name and a concept he already had access to in English and shortened it to Mulek.
This next one always cracks me up, the statistical miracle of the alphabet. Apologists will say, the Book of Mormon has hundreds of unique names, and none of them use the letters W, Q, or X. What are the odds of an uneducated farm boy knowing ancient Hebrew didn't use those letters?
The odds are 100% because standard Hebrew to English transliteration rules do not use those letters. Anyone modeling their made-up names off the King James Bible Old Testament, which Smith clearly was doing with names like Lehi, Nephi, and Sam, would naturally avoid W, Q, and X simply by mimicking the style.
It is a completely fake statistical miracle.
It really is.
And finally, the appeal to secular authority. Harold Bloom. Apologists love to claim that Harold Bloom, The legendary Yale literary critic praised Joseph Smith and loved the Book of Mormon. They use it as secular validation of the text's brilliance.
This is perhaps the most frustrating misrepresentation in the bundle. Harold Bloom did call Joseph Smith an authentic religious genius, but he was praising Smith's charisma, his imagination, and his ability to found a new, enduring American religion.
He wasn't talking about the book itself.
No. In the exact same book where he said that, Bloom called the Book of Mormon itself poor literature, dull, and highly polemical. He explicitly stated that he couldn't even finish reading it because it was so tedious.
Oh, wow.
Mark Twain was far more accurate to the secular literary consensus when he famously called the book chloroform in print. Citing Bloom as a literary endorsement of the ancient text is simply false.
So when you unbundle the miracles, when you actually look at the mechanisms behind each claim, they fall apart individually. They aren't pillars supporting a building. They are a house of cards.
Precisely.
And this raises a profound question, which leads us to epistemology. How should we test a historical document? If we strip away the apologetics, how do historians actually determine if an ancient text is telling the truth?
The sources offer a fascinating comparative methodology for exactly this. They outline 8 marks of authentic eyewitness testimony used by historians and textual critics to validate ancient documents.
Okay.
They specifically use the New Testament Gospels as a baseline for comparison to show how a text that passes the test actually functions.
What are those 8 marks?
They include accurate locations and rulers, correct customs and culture, undesigned coincidences between independent accounts, unnecessary but accurate details, unexplained allusions that only make sense in the historical context, reconcilable variation across multiple accounts, consistent supporting personalities, and a culturally embedded central figure.
Okay. Let's apply the X-ray machine. How does the Book of Mormon hold up to those 8 historical tests?
It completely fails, all of them, or structurally cannot even be tested by them.
Give me an example. Let's look at locations and rulers.
In the Gospels, the text names dozens of independently confirmed cities: Jerusalem, Capernaum, Bethlehem. It names specific officials whose existence is proven by archaeology, like Pontius Pilate or the high priest Caiaphas.
Right.
The Book of Mormon, on the other hand, names hundreds of cities and kings spanning 1,000 years of history, and not a single one have ever been independently confirmed by a piece of archaeology. Not one.
What about undesigned coincidences? I find that concept fascinating.
An undesigned coincidence is when 2 independent accounts of the same event leave out different details. But when you put them together, they perfectly answer each other's lingering questions without meaning to.
But to test for that, you need multiple independent accounts.
Exactly. The Book of Mormon is a single text produced by a single dictation event from a single author. It has 0 external corroborating textual traditions. It can't even take the test.
And the central figure, Jesus Christ himself, appears in the Book of Mormon after his resurrection.
Yes, and when Jesus appears in the Book of Mormon, he doesn't sound like a first-century Galilean Jew operating in an ancient Mesoamerican context. He sounds exactly like a 17th-century King James Bible, right down to quoting those italicized 1611 English translation errors.
He is not culturally embedded in the ancient world. He is embedded in Joseph Smith's world.
Precisely.
But here comes the ultimate whataboutism from the defenders of the text. They will say, well, hold on. The Bible has historical problems too. You can't prove the Exodus happened exactly as written. You can't hold the Book of Mormon to a standard of absolute archaeological perfection that the Bible also fails.
The sources are very clear on the massive asymmetry of this argument. Yes, the Bible has intensely debated historical details, particularly in the older texts. But those debates happen within a massive, overwhelmingly confirmed historical framework.
We know Jerusalem exists.
We know it exists. We have Egyptian inscriptions naming pharaohs. We have Assyrian reliefs depicting the siege of Israelite cities. We have the Cyrus cylinder confirming the biblical account of the Persian king allowing captives to return.
We have hundreds of externally attested, archaeologically verified anchor points.
Right. The dispute with the Bible is over specific narrative details within a real world. The Book of Mormon has 0 external anchor points, not one city, not one coin, not one inscription. The dispute with the Book of Mormon isn't over details. The dispute is whether the entire physical world it describes ever existed at all.
Which leaves the apologist, the missionary, or the faithful believer with one final defense: the trump card. Moroni chapter 10, verse 4.
The spiritual witness.
Yes. When all the archaeology, the DNA, and the textual evidence goes against the text, the missionary will look you in the eye and say, just read it, pray about it with a sincere heart, and God will tell you it's true through a burning in your bosom. How do you argue with a profound emotional feeling?
You don't argue with the reality of the feeling is genuine. What you must question is the epistemology, the method of knowing. The sources point out that this is structurally pure circular reasoning.
You are using a promise found inside the text to prove that the text is true.
Exactly. But more importantly, from an epistemological standpoint, this exact same subjective test produces contradictory results across the world.
Right. If the feeling is the ultimate arbiter of truth, what happens when it gives two different answers?
Sincere, deeply devoted believers in Islam read the Quran, pray, and experience a powerful spiritual confirmation that Muhammad is the final prophet. Members of fundamentalist Mormon polygamist sects pray and receive a burning in the bosom, confirming that their specific excommunicated prophet is the true successor.
And sincere Pentecostal Christians experience overwhelming spiritual feelings that tell them the Book of Mormon is false.
A feeling that confirms 5 mutually exclusive, completely contradictory things cannot be a reliable indicator of historical truth.
It simply cannot. You cannot use a subjective feeling to override massive, verifiable empirical disconfirmation. The feeling of elevation, of peace, of spiritual connection, that feeling is real, but it's a well-documented psychological response to devotion, community, and the human longing for transcendence.
It is not a historical verification of pre-Columbian steel swords or Hebrew DNA in ancient America.
Wow. We have covered an immense amount of ground today. And as we synthesize this journey, the picture that emerges from the sources is overwhelmingly, relentlessly consistent.
It is a very clear picture.
When evaluated on its own merits, free from the insulation of apologetic rescue devices, the Book of Mormon's physical footprint in the dirt is non-existent. Its genetic claims about human bodies are thoroughly disproven by modern science.
Right.
Its textual fingerprint firmly places its creation in 1820s upstate New York, heavily aided by a 1611 King James Bible, local cultural panics, and contemporary speculative texts like View of the Hebrews.
And this means the burden of proof has shifted entirely. Apologists can no longer just pluck one isolated issue like horses and offer a hypothetical loose translation defense and then move on.
And they can't play whack-a-mole anymore.
No. They are facing a massive, converging pattern of systematic disconfirmation across multiple scientific and historical disciplines. To defend the historicity of the text, they must explain all of it. The DNA, the italics, the anachronisms, the 19th century theology, without retreating into unfalsifiable theories that require abandoning their own foundational narrative.
It's like staring at that medical x-ray we talked about at the very beginning of the show. Only this time, the doctor isn't just pointing at a broken bone. He's pointing at the film and telling you that the arm you're looking at isn't even human.
It's a completely different anatomy altogether.
Which leaves you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive. Think about the psychology of belief. We are all deeply tied to our foundational narratives. When a religious tradition is confronted with a document that so comprehensively reflects the time of its 19th century author, rather than the ancient world it claims to describe, why do apologetic defenses become more complex, rather than accepting the simpler, more obvious answer?
It's a profound question.
What happens to a community's foundation, to their sense of self, when the literal history it rests upon is slowly, painfully transformed by its own scholars into a metaphor, just to survive the scientific era? Ponder that until next time.